So in the end, and no surprise here, given what happened yesterday in qualifying for the US Grand Prix, the race was indeed a nail-biter. A brilliant win for Max Verstappen and Red Bull Honda. Excellent drive by Lewis Hamilton to finish second in the factory Mercedes. And the interesting point, I think, overall, apart from this being a brilliant race for the United States, for Formula One in the United States, and we even had a good old-fashioned track invasion right at the end. Phenomenal crowd. But putting all that to one side, I think the key point about this US Grand Prix is that it was this nail-biter, but there wasn't a massive amount of overtaking for the lead. It was all in the pit stops, it was all in the strategy, it was all in the tension, the pace. The errors, if they were going to be committed, the passing manoeuvres, not so much. So it's a question, I think, that should be put in the next Formula One survey. If Formula One races are as good as the 2021 US Grand Prix, do we necessarily need all this extra overtaking that everybody keeps talking about? Anyway, that's just one of my small rants, really, because generally speaking, I don't think surveys ever really ask the right questions. Anyway, moving on to the way this race went. We talked yesterday about that brilliant pole lap for Max Verstappen. Well, you could argue now, I suppose, that, what was it all about? Because he actually made a pretty slow, tardy start away from the line. His reaction time was good, but the Mercedes on the inside and the dirty side of the road had a really good run up the hill. And by the time they got to the hairpin, there was not really very much that Max could do about it, apart from sort of be there and run a bit wide and then come back actually into third place behind Sergio Perez here. A big shout out to Sergio for the way he just backed off and allowed Max to take P2 going into the S's. That was a very, very significant move by Sergio. And I wondered, I was just watching that, I wonder if George Russell's going to be doing that sort of thing for Lewis next year. I very much doubt it. Anyway, good job there, Sergio. And just to finish the Sergio Perez story, his drink bottle then failed to work after about lap 2. So the poor guy, on a very hot day, 30-degree day in Texas, did the entire Grand Prix with no fluids going through his body. So very good job by him to finish a third, albeit a distant third, but very good teammate behaviour there going into the S's, as I say. Anyway, let's get on with it, because it was now Lewis Hamilton leading the US Grand Prix, which was a bit of a shock, I guess, for everybody at Red Bull, particularly Max Verstappen. But within 2 laps, it was very clear that Max had more grip everywhere. And of course, right behind Lewis, once DRS came into play, there was no issue on the straight at all. Even without DRS, we saw later in the race, it was about 4 kilometres an hour difference. Not a lot, not a massive amount, depending on how much power they were putting through the engine at any given moment, following instructions from the pit wall, of course. So there wasn't that much in the top speeds. But generally speaking, throughout the lap, the Red Bull on the medium tyre was the quicker car. And that was pretty clear after about lap 3. Lewis was saying he seems to be quicker than me. Max was saying he's sliding around. I'm not, obviously. And you thought, yeah, it's only a matter of time, really. There'll be an undercut from Max. He'll probably get the lead in the pit stops, and then it will be all over. Well, the interesting thing here is that is kind of what happened from Red Bull's point of view. But what Mercedes did, and I think it was absolutely brilliant strategy, totally correct, was to say the only way we're really going to win this race now with a slightly inferior car is if we can elongate the stints and try at the end of the race to be on a much newer set of tyres than Max Verstappen. That's going to require Lewis to do a really long middle stint. But we've got Lewis Hamilton, and if anybody can get a long stint out of hard tyres with the fuel load going down, the variables beginning to come into play, maybe a bit of wind coming up as well. If anybody can maximise that situation and try to make the tyres last, it is, of course, Lewis Hamilton. Well, I think Max Verstappen could probably do it as well, but he wasn't in a position to need to do that. He was just in a position to win this race. There was a lot of talk afterwards about Max using an aggressive strategy. And I think if you look at his race compared with Lewis, it was indeed very aggressive in terms of when he came in for his first set of hards and when he came in for his second set of hard Pirellis. But if you look at it in the context of the race as a whole, Max wasn't aggressive. Lewis was the only one out of sync, actually, who was very long in his middle stint. Actually, 3 laps long in his first stint, but then excessively long in his middle stint. And that was what it was all about. It wasn't Max being aggressive. It was about Lewis being even more aggressive by making that middle stint so long. And that was what stood out. And I thought Lewis's driving in that stint to get in a position where he could take the race to Max over the last 20 laps was, that's what the US Grand Prix was all about. So let's look at Max first of all. He came in about the same time as everybody else at the end of that first medium run. He came in after 10 laps. I mean, Sergio Perez came in after 12. Daniel Ricciardo, the 2 McLarens, are in sort of 11 and 12. So he was in a lap. And the Ferraris as well came in all at the same time, basically as Max Verstappen. So he was absolutely doing the correct race strategy on the medium tyre. And then on the second stint, Max, 19 laps on that second stint, the first set of hard tyres. Sergio Perez 18, Charles Leclerc 20, Daniel Ricciardo 19, Valtteri Bottas in the other Mercedes 19, the same as Max Verstappen, Carlos Sainz 8. Well, Carlos was kind of out of it anyway because he started on the soft tyre. So, yeah, Max was just driving the conventional race, the correct race to win at the highest possible, with the lowest possible time, highest possible speed on the Pirellis given, obviously the medium hard combination. Good to have 2 pit stops for a change as well in Formula One, I thought. So let's get back to Max Verstappen's racing. He's on the medium tyre, he's behind Lewis, and guess what? On a heavy fuel load, he's actually getting more tyre wear on the medium tyre than Lewis is. That's one of the reasons I think that Lewis was able to run a little bit longer, was thinking about running longer, and Mercedes were on that first stint. So Max is following Lewis now on the medium tyre in this first stint, all over Lewis really after about 3 laps. As I say, very clear that the Red Bull's got a lot more grip, and Lewis doing a really good job of just trying not to make any mistakes and just staying as smooth and as neat as he possibly could. But the interesting thing is that after about 12 laps, Max's lap time started to go up a little bit, which suggests that in the turbulence of the Mercedes on the medium tyre with a heavyish fuel load, it was going to degrade the medium tyre faster than perhaps Red Bull were anticipating had Max been in the lead. So I think to some extent, Max not taking the lead into the first corner kind of dictated his race in that he was never going to run a long first stint on the medium tyre. Nonetheless, he went to the hard tyre. And at this point, I think another factor came into play, which eventually added up to Max's win at the Circuit of America, and that was how good he was on his out laps and his flying lap past the pits after the pit stop. 58.8 he did after that first pit stop, now on his first set of new hard tyres. And Lewis, who came in 3 laps later, 2:01.3, so a big difference there. Anyway, regardless of that, Max was now leading the race by approximately 6 seconds. And at this moment, with both drivers on hard tyres, albeit Max is 3 laps older than Lewis, you thought, yeah, this is it. I mean, obviously the Red Bull's a quicker car. This is going to be the American Grand Prix. Shame it's going to be quite boring now because Max is probably just going to inexorably pull away and probably win by 10 to 12 seconds. Well, that's not what happened, because after about 12 laps, Max's first set of hard tyres hit a cliff and went off big time. And that was a bit of a shock, I think, to everybody in the pit lane, particularly Red Bull. And obviously then they had to start thinking about bringing him in for his second set of hard tyres and looking at how long potentially the next stint was going to be. And I think from Mercedes' point of view, they suddenly thought, here is a window where we can maybe win this Grand Prix and we can try to extend that middle stint. So they were straight on the radio to Lewis saying, Max looks to be in trouble. Look after the tyres. Let's extend this stint for as long as we possibly can. And that was a great call by Mercedes, but an even greater response, as I keep saying, by Lewis Hamilton, I think, to elongate that stint thereafter. 24 laps he did in the middle stint. And compare that, of course, with Max's 19 laps. There's a big difference. So by the time Lewis got onto his final set of hard tyres, Max's hard tyres were already 7 laps old. And if you throw in that falling off the cliff business and you look at the last 7 or 8 laps of the race and potentially how quick Lewis could be on a lighter fuel load, you look at, as Toto Wolff said on about lap 50, Lewis, this is now a race for the win. In the second pit stop, Max Verstappen still retook the lead and he was about 6 seconds ahead, but Lewis very, very quickly reduced that from 5.4 to 3 and then down to 2 seconds. It was really interesting at that point, I thought, to compare the styles of the 2 drivers and come up with, well, they're both driving almost identical races and identical laps of the Circuit of America. It was very, very difficult to see any differences between the 2, which I think was kind of pleasing because it bears out everything we've been saying about Max Verstappen being the same sort of driver as Lewis Hamilton. Everything was smooth edges. There were very, very few moments of anything going wrong or dramatic. But here was the difference. Max was having to do that while looking after the rear tyres, very conscious that the last 5 laps of the race were going to be critical. And Lewis, with his newer tyres, could actually play around with the Mercedes a little bit more, perhaps be a little bit more aggressive in traffic, things like that. So it was a really interesting moment to compare the 2 drivers and how well Max at this point was driving, a little bit like Lewis in the middle of his long middle stint. So both of them showed how good they are at massaging the tyres and getting a lap time out of the car without caning the rears. Consistency doesn't even begin to sum up how good these two drivers were at this stage of the race. If you look at, say, let's pick some laps. Lap 45, you've got Max Verstappen 39.6, 39.5, 39.5, 39.1, 39.2, 39.1, 39.2, 39.4, 39.0. That's what Lewis Hamilton was having to face. But of course, he was on newer tyres. So let's look at his consistency: 39.2, 39.0, 38.8, 38.8, 38.8, 38.9, 38.8. Talk about remorseless. I mean, at this point, he's two seconds behind Max approximately. Pressure, I cannot even imagine what sort of pressure that was. I mean, Max said afterwards, the last few laps were quite fun. Yeah, right. I mean, that was more than fun. That was serious Formula One pressure. And as I say, to me, that is what this sport, that's what this sport that we love is all about. That sort of building of pressure, just staggering. But guess what? I think right at the end of the race, Lewis's tyres went off a little bit as well, because if you look at the lap times, Lewis's lap times, he's doing 39.6, 39.2, 39.1, 39.4, 39.9. And Max is getting, he's right there. And on his last lap, the last lap of the race, he's purple in sector 1. Absolutely brilliant on tyres that by that stage had done 27 laps. We talk about Lewis's middle stint, 24 laps. Max did 27 laps on that last stint. So, I mean, both drivers I thought were just superb. I think Red Bull were in the position to be beaten because Max actually didn't take the lead off the line. I think that's what changed it all for Red Bull. But then equally, I think Mercedes responded in a way that, I don't know, I would never have thought about that. I mean, just to extend that middle stint the way Lewis did was just outstanding. Let's look at the second outlaps of the two drivers, because I love comparing those two, because they're on slightly cold tyres there. And it does give an indication of how drivable the Red Bull and the Mercedes are in those conditions. And I think that to some extent sums up the difference between the Red Bull and the Merc come race day in Austin. Max's second flying lap was a 59.7 and Lewis's was a 2:00.017. So again, he had Lewis on that outlap. And a lot of that would have been down to just being drivable, as I say, how good that Red Bull is when the conditions go away. And I think to sum up, I've been saying all along that Mercedes have benefited from the stiffer rear Pirelli, and I stand by that. That isn't to say that Red Bull were ever going to be slow. It just means that the gap is much smaller, and on some occasions, Red Bull are still going to be able to beat Mercedes. If you compare what we saw in Austin today with the beginning of this year and the difference, how much quicker the Red Bull was, you see where I'm coming from. But it doesn't mean to say that Mercedes is going to win every race, quite clearly. And here, I think a lot of Red Bull's pace was in that sector 1 through the S's, that high-speed downforce section, which just brought the best out in Adrian Newey's car. And Adrian, after his recent major shunt on his bike, holidaying somewhere. Good to see him on the pit wall, enjoying, I bet, every minute. Well, not enjoying. He's probably incredibly tense throughout the race, but enjoying certainly the bit after the checkered flag. Other little bits and bobs. I thought it was quite funny that on the last lap, Max is, obviously everything's on this last lap and he's got to get it perfect. And who's in front of him but Nikita Mazepin? He's on the radio, make sure he gets out of the way, which to Nikita's credit, he did. They were giving Lewis a bit of encouragement towards the end by saying, it looks like the wind's changing a bit. He obviously thinks, they obviously realised, and they obviously know that Lewis, when there's crosswind or tailwind or whatever it is and things are changing, Lewis comes into his own. But, I looked at that point to the wind thing, it was 0.5 of a mile an hour, so or maybe even a kilometre an hour, so I don't think it was that strong. Say lap 50, Max is on the radio saying, how many laps to go? But that wasn't just, I want to get this race over with. It was, I've got to pace the way I'm using the rear tyres. And that was an indication of what that was all about. So, I just thought it was a superb Grand Prix. A little bit like that Michael Schumacher, Fernando Alonso Imola Grand Prix of years ago, when the two, were just like this for all the race. And I think this was a similar race. And I think it was a classic example, as I say, of how good Formula One can be when there isn't a lot of overtaking. Survey people, take note. So let's look at the other results. Sergio was good third, distant good third. Great result for Red Bull Honda. Charles Leclerc, equally excellent drive in the Ferrari to finish fourth. Very lonely race, didn't really race anybody. He was just there on his own, doing what he did, way quicker than Daniel Ricciardo, who finished fifth, drove very well. Bit of a skirmish with Carlos Sainz in the first lap or two. But real racing, bit of wheel banging going on. And Carlos, I think, was reasonably okay with that. But eventually Valtteri Bottas finished sixth, as he should in a Mercedes, really, beating Carlos Sainz, splitting those two, if you like. But a bit disappointing, I thought. Valtteri, he was okay. I know he started P9 with his penalty and stuff, but he is in a Mercedes, and he would have thought maybe he would be beating, I don't know, Charles Leclerc. I would have thought, but anyway, he didn't. And Carlos Sainz seventh. Lando Norris, a little bit of an off day. He seemed to get really bad traffic all the time. He nearly got Sainz and Daniel on the opening lap, but then didn't, and then he got stuck behind Sainz, and it kind of, coloured his race thereafter, but he still finished in the points, finished eighth. Wasn't a great race for him, but I don't think he drove badly in any way. I think he still drove really well. Yuki Tsunoda eventually finished ninth. Yeah, he's been there all weekend, isn't he? Doing a good job. And Sebastian Vettel, the first of the guys that started from the back of the grid with all their penalties, actually finished 10th and scored a point. The other two, George Russell was 14th, and Fernando Alonso, who was really aggressive as well and had some major dramas going on with Antonio Giovinazzi at one point, giving places back. Both of them had to give places back at some point, cancel one another out. But neither Alpine finished, interestingly enough. But I think they both had the same thing, something at the back of the car. They said, I wish they'd say a lot more. And it was this race a few years ago. I think that Ferrari had a drama with damper mountings breaking or something like that. I wonder if it was a suspension thing rather than anything to do with the transmission. Anyway, hopefully at some point we might find out when the teams decide that we're old enough to know something about the technology. So that was kind of it. I think this race was it was a seminal race in many ways, I think, for Formula One in the United States. It's been Austin's taken a while to get traction, and who am I to say this, but I think part of the crowd today and part of what we saw going on, I think a lot of it is to do with the way Liberty have changed their use of social media and the digital platforms they're now using for Formula One. But I think beyond that, I think you starve a crowd, as COVID did last year for the US Grand Prix. And what are they going to do the following year? It's a bit of the Bernie Ecclestone philosophy, less is more. The more you take it away, the more they're going to want it. So there's a little bit of Bernie in there as well, probably, in terms of the success of this race and of where we're going. So, a very, very good US Grand Prix. An excellent win for Max Verstappen. I think an interesting debating point would be which was of higher quality, his pole lap or his driving in the race to win the Grand Prix. I suppose you've got to say the race ultimately, because as good as the pole lap was, it kind of disappeared after 4 seconds of the lights going out. So in that sense, this was just a really, really mature drive. I think back to all the people that used to say, oh, Max Verstappen's gone crazy. This is in the first 2 or 3 years of his career. Is he ever going to be a great driver? He's crazy, he does this. To me, he's always been this sort of driver. And what we saw today was Max just perfectly using everything at his disposal. The team was very calm. And like Lewis, when he had to look after the tyres but still be very quick, as Lewis was on his second set of tyres, the first set of hards, then Max, like Lewis, has shown that he has that quality as well. And it was just wonderful to watch. So that was it. That was my US Grand Prix, and look forward to the Mexican Grand Prix coming up in 2 weeks' time. I wonder what everyone will be doing right now, staying out there, I hope. In reality, I hope this is an opportunity for Formula One to stay in America and really build on the success of this race. Let's have the drivers doing early morning chat shows, getting out there, really beating the drum about Formula One, whipping it up for Miami and Austin next year. Will they be doing that? I doubt it very much. They'll probably be jetting off to all corners of the globe before they go to Mexico in 2 weeks' time. But I think they should. I think Liberty should force the drivers to stay and the teams to stay in the United States, really to capitalize on this race. Because quite often they have to leave because it's a double header. But it isn't a double header. They've got a bit of time to stick around, and I hope they do. Anyway, that's all for this race. Look forward to seeing you soon.